Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and I especially appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today about something relatively new at Duke called the World Food Policy Center. And the concept behind the center is that people around the world who work on food policy issues tend to work in particular areas, siloed, narrow areas, where they don't connect too much with people who work on other issues related to food policy. And that leaves a lot of gaps unfilled, and lack of coordination is pretty rampant around the world. And so we thought there would be a role for somebody to try to bridge that gap and work across areas rather than to recreate depth in any one particular area. So I'll explain more what that means, but that's the basic idea. So let's take a little world tour of food policy. And the work we're going to do, by the way, is very global but also very local. And there are lots of opportunities for students to work with us. So if any of you are interested in doing that, just please get in touch. So first, why are these food policy issues so important, and why is bridging so important? Well, here's an interesting paper that got published in the journal called The Lancet that looks at leading causes of death in country after country all around the world. And it's very interesting if you look at the leading causes. The leading risk factors for causes for death are these. And it's interesting how many of these involve food in one way or another. Now, some of them are pretty intuitive, like high salt diet is related to high blood pressure. You could see that high blood sugar would be related to body weight and other things like that. But also, both indoor and outdoor air pollution are affected by the way we produce and cook food around the world. So food is implicated in a lot of interesting issues. So we are thinking at our World Food Policy Center of 4 essential clusters of world food problems. Now, these are pretty arbitrary. You could have 2 clusters or 10 or 20. But the 4 that we have are fairly intuitive. So the first cluster would be hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition, or stunting. They use that to refer to the problem around the world. But it's pretty obvious what that involves. So I'll get more into that in a minute. The second would be what some people feel is the flip side of hunger, which is obesity. It turns out not to be the flip side at all, but that's a major world problem, now affecting more people worldwide than hunger. And the environmental impact of agriculture, this reciprocal relationship between agriculture and environment is extremely important and interesting. Then a 4th cluster could be food safety and defense issues. And the word defense is in there because of concerns about intentional poisoning of the food supply as acts of bioterrorism. Now, if you look around about how food policy gets established, it's really all these different fields or players or institutions are working, sometimes at cross purposes, in this sort of a muddle of efforts to address world food problems. And the policy picture is what comes out of it. But the question is the picture as positive as it might be, or could it be improved by bridging these areas rather than just having all these players work quite independently from one another? So taking each problem one at a time, let's just give you a sense of the world issue. So world hunger, or what more recently has been called food insecurity, affects vast numbers of people worldwide with completely devastating consequences. A malnourished child, for example, can't learn, is highly susceptible to contagious and other diseases. People who are malnourished can't work as they might wish and support their families, so world hunger is a real problem. And as you can see, nearly 800 million people affected by that. A recent paper came out talking about how many people are victims of starvation just in 4 countries, and you get a sense of the numbers from this. Now, given that hunger is a problem now, what might we expect the pressures on the world food supply to be as time goes forward? And if you look at projected population growth, you can see that a lot more people are getting added every day to the world's numbers, and this creates more and more pressure on the food system. So there are really grave questions about whether people can be fed with the current existing agriculture technology, or if technology is able to keep up with this, at what cost to the environment primarily, or to human health. So it's an interesting little figure that I found from somebody not too long ago that is really quite amazing. So you can see how much food the world is going to have to produce just to keep up with the population growth. Now, given that these, and so when we look at hunger, we generally think of what's going on outside the United States, but of course there's hunger in Durham, in North Carolina, in every city and state in the United States. Even places that you'd otherwise consider pretty wealthy, people suffer from food insecurity, and in some cases it's really quite severe. And in a country like the United States that produces more food than it can consume, it's amazing that people go hungry. And then if you look around the world, there are political and economic problems that get in the way of distributing food to people who really need it. There are civil wars, there are droughts, refugee issues, and a lot of other things that lead to great amounts of human suffering. Part of that is food insecurity. But within a country like the United States that's politically stable, one wonders why we can't feed our people better than we do. Now, there is some good news on the horizon. Now, if I were just to take the rest of my time speaking and talk about the dire circumstances that the world's food system is in, you'd end up feeling pretty discouraged. But there is some good news. I'm going to give you good news in each of the segments that I'm going to talk about. And part of the good news is the decline in the number of people around the world who are malnourished. And so this graph shows over a period of time the prevalence of people that are undernourished in the world, and you can see the numbers have gone down. And that's due to a lot of effort by different countries, and especially foundations like the Gates Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation and other places like that that have put a lot of money into helping address world hunger. It's also partly due to tremendous advances in agriculture technology to be able to produce plants that will grow in areas with low water circumstances, to create new breeds of plants that are resistant to pests and things. And those advances have really helped as well. But you can see the numbers are still high, but at least they're improving, which is really nice. The whole issue of trying to feed the world and then the complexity of the debate over genetically modified foods becomes extremely interesting in this context. So quickly, let's turn our attention to the next issue, obesity. And as I said, some people feel this is the flip side of hunger, but it turns out not to be at all. And in some cases, it's produced by exactly the same set of environmental and economic circumstances that drive hunger. So here are some pretty interesting data about the projected increases in diabetes. So behind those orange boxes there, you're going to see some numbers about expected increases in the US and in China and India. So in the US, we're expecting this kind of increase going forward to 2030. But in China, the numbers will look like this, and in India, the numbers will look like this. Now, almost all these cases of diabetes are driven by obesity. So whoever thought the day would arrive when countries like China and India would be suffering from an epidemic of obesity? But the numbers in those countries are pretty high and growing higher. And given the size of the populations, the numbers of new cases being added to the world incidence of diabetes is really pretty remarkable. There's kind of bad news and good news. So if you look at world trends, this was a paper published in 2016 that concluded this, that in all likelihood, meeting any kind of goals to reduce obesity around the world is essentially zero, because the trends are increasing in countries around the world, is a pretty discouraging thing to hear, isn't it? But on the other hand, there is some good news that I'll share with you in just a minute. But one very interesting thing is the coexistence of hunger and obesity. something that is called the dual burden in many places. So in a city like Durham, hunger and obesity coexist. They coexist in the US, they coexist basically in every country in the world. Well, how can this be? Wouldn't it be true that you either have too much food or too little food? No, it turns out not to be. That poverty and other circumstances drive both undernutrition and overnutrition. That's really the common link between the two. But there's also a biological link that people who have experienced early malnutrition in life are more prone to obesity and diabetes later in life. Probably because the body has learned an important lesson early in life that you're going to be starved and malnourished, and you need to do everything you can to be efficient with calories when they're available. And then when they are available later in life, for some people, then obesity and diabetes can be the result. So this hunger and obesity coexisting in certain geographic areas creates a really interesting set of circumstances. And here's a pretty powerful example of it. These are data that have been collected that show life expectancy by zip code. And this is a particular area right near us. So you've got Duke right here, and you've got Raleigh down to the bottom right. And you can see really quite remarkable variation in life expectancy depending on where you live. And you can just see it here. There's a wealthy area by the airport compared to an area in southeast Raleigh. And the difference in life expectancy is 12 years by people separated by only 14 miles. So in the United States now, the most powerful predictor of your life expectancy is not risk factors like smoking or weight or other things like this. It's not your family history, it's your zip code. Because your social circumstances are such a powerful driver. Now there are a lot of reasons for this 12-year discrepancy, but food has to be one of them. So the people in southeast Raleigh, you can imagine, have both higher levels of hunger, malnutrition, and higher levels of obesity than people up here that help explain that 12-year difference. There's some very interesting examples of this. This is Chicago, where two areas separated by only 3 miles have a 16-year difference in life expectancy. And here's some very interesting data that this group just published recently about 5 counties along one highway where the life expectancy changes by 7 years. Where are these counties? Well, we're going to start at Durham, which is over here on the left, which is not part of the data, but the data begin in Raleigh and then go east on Highway 64 in North Carolina. So that's pretty remarkable that these contiguous counties have such a difference in life expectancy. Those counties, some of which we're going to work with in our World Food Policy Center, have very high levels of poverty. Even though they're agriculturally based counties, people have trouble getting food, access to food, and both levels of obesity and diabetes are quite high. But going back to this one highway, 5 counties in 7 years, I just did a little math. And so as you're driving east from Raleigh, every 10 minutes you drive, life expectancy drops by 265 days. Pretty remarkable. So getting food right is a pretty important thing. Not the only thing that contributes to this, as I said before, but it's important. So on the topic of obesity, what is some of the good news? There's tough news that we have to face, but what about the good news? Well, there's actually a lot of it, especially coming from the United States. So I'd like to introduce to you the concept of defaults, which is very important in this context. The idea of defaults in a public health setting refers to creating conditions where people are healthy by default rather than unhealthy by default. And this is very common in public health settings. So for example, when this building was built, you expected that the air system produce air that's not going to make you sick. And so we have ceded that authority to government, and we're willing to pay for that. and the regulatory structure that makes it happen. Now, we could say government doesn't belong in that space and that it's up to us to remediate the risks we're exposed to. So we could all wear masks, or we could have an oxygen tank that we bring with us so we'd be having clean air. But of course we don't want that. So we give government that authority. That creates a healthy air default. And some of you have bottled water in front of you. You're expecting that that water will be safe and it won't make you sick. So the same set of defaults exist. So people are beginning to use this philosophy in addressing the obesity problem by trying to create different defaults that make healthy choices the easy choice and unhealthy choices the harder choice. So there are lots of examples of this, but to use a non-food example, let's take tobacco. Taxes on cigarettes are sky high around the country, and they're much higher in some states than others. Given that North Carolina is a tobacco producing state, you can imagine that the taxes are quite low in the state, which turns out to be true. We also have higher rates of lung cancer than other states that don't have, and heart disease, than other states that do have higher taxes. But as you increase taxes, you change the set of economic defaults because it's just harder to buy cigarettes. And so that would be an example of changing the default. So there's some interesting food-related ones too. On the information front, there are jurisdictions around the country that have put into effect calorie labeling regulations where restaurants have to post calories on menus. New York City was the first place to do this, but others have as well. The Obama administration, through the Affordable Care Act, put in regulations to enact this requirement nationally so that chain restaurants would have to post calories on menus. We don't know yet what the Trump administration is going to do about that, but there's a lot of concern that it will get undone. Putting trans fats on the nutrition label gave people more information about that particular part of their diet. And added sugars are going to be added, presumably, depending on what the Trump administration does, to food labels going forward. So that gives people more information and changes that default. The default in the past has really been a free-for-all, where the food industry has been able to take things that really aren't very healthy, but make them look that way by lots of health claims and things. The economic defaults are beginning to change. And one of the key examples of that are soda taxes, a topic that I've worked on for many years. So soda taxes now exist outside the United States in about a dozen places, including France and Mexico. And they now have been passed in the United States in a number of places. Berkeley was the first place to do it. Oakland and San Francisco followed not too long after. But it's not just the West Coast California cities that have done this. Philadelphia and Chicago have done it as well. So if taxes on soda increase the prices, the same rule applies that would occur with cigarettes. That as price goes up, people are less inclined to buy the product and consumption goes down. And then there are also a whole set of access defaults that are really interesting, like changing the nutrition regulations in school so kids are exposed to healthier foods. So, if you have a child and you send that child to school, you don't want them to be in an unsafe air or water environment. You want them to be in an unsafe food environment either. And unsafe in this case would be high calories, high fat, high salt, high sugar, for example. But there are other defaults that are changing. And these things work. So soda taxes work, for example. So this will seem like a perplexing slide, but it's actually some leaked information from the Coca Cola company that got posted on the web. This was Coca Cola Europe, and they put together a whole list of things that going up the y-axis rather, they are talking about adverse impact on their business. And over here, they're talking about things that are most likely to happen. And at the very top right, you see soda taxes as the thing that they feel is the greatest threat to their business. So if these things didn't work, the companies wouldn't be so threatened by them and worried about them. So let's turn our attention to agriculture and environment. So your generation is a lot different than mine in our attitudes and ideas about foods. So when I was growing up, nobody paid any attention at all to where their food came from. It came from a package, and that was about it. a bag or a bottle or a box. But you never cared about what kind of conditions the workers might have had while they were growing the food, or how far it was shipped to get to you, or whether it was organic or not. And so right now, people in your generation are much, much more interested than any previous generation, except when you go back to the place people were actually raising their own food, about the story of their food. They want to know these things. And it's why more and more in restaurants you see a board on the wall that has the names of the farmers where the food came from. People care about that kind of thing. That's a good sign. That's a very good sign. And it means that people are getting more and more sensitized to the importance of agriculture. Even people not involved in it realize that it's involved in their lives and they care about it more. So there are a lot of reasons to think about agriculture, and this is just a partial list. And you could make a much bigger list if you were inclined to, but these are just some of them. But let's just take these two, and give you an example. So animal agriculture in particular has raised a lot of concerns, both about water usage and about climate change. And let me give you a little sense of the extent of animal agriculture. And I'm going to use one county in North Carolina as the exemplar here. Duplin County, North Carolina, which is right here, and I'll help you place it by putting in where we are and where some other cities are, is a county of about 60,000 residents. That county has lots of these things. So 2 million pigs in this one county. But we're just getting started. What about adding 5 million turkeys almost? And then what about adding 69 million chickens? One county. So you can imagine the health impact on the people who live in that county. But also some people care a lot about the welfare of the animals and the environmental consequences of meat production. And so North Carolina is an incredibly interesting agriculture state. And there's a lot more to it than just meat production, but that's what we're talking about at the moment. But to give you a sense of where we stand nationally, these are the top pig producing counties in the country, and the top two are both North Carolina counties. Now, people who work on agriculture issues say this is all hidden, that what we want is the end product of this process, and we close our eyes to what's happening with the process itself. And so migrant laborers who come and work in the farm fields in North Carolina and other places are part of that hidden picture. The sharecropping history and mentality preceded by slavery is very much a part of this. The systematic stripping of land ownership from black families is part of this picture. The environmental consequences is very much part of this picture. So it's all behind some curtain. We like the end product because we're consuming lots of these kind of foods. But more and more that curtain's beginning to open, and people are peering behind it and wondering what's there, and they care about it. And so big companies, like the big restaurant chains and the companies that sell a lot of food like Walmart, are paying a lot more attention than they used to where their food gets sourced and what's happening along that way. And so hopefully that's a positive development, and we'll see where it goes. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on in North Carolina around food, but of course this could be in any state. But let's return to North Carolina, and I'll give you an example of an interesting food thing from the state fair, which is about to come up. So like every other state fair around the country, North Carolina has its share of what some people would call frankenfoods. You know, foods that are just so completely bizarre, like, you know, deep fried Girl Scout cookies and things like that. But I found a really interesting example at the state fair of deep fried Tootsie Rolls that they sell. But wait, those deep fried Tootsie Rolls are, and they have, so can you imagine a more efficient vehicle in which to deliver sugar and fat than this? So that's just a little amusing aside, but it's a very interesting picture. So let's get back to the two things we were going to talk about, water and climate. So water is a real problem around the world because the increasing world's population and increasing use of water is draining the supply. And where does the water get used? Well, we use it in households. People around the world do. It gets used in industry as they're creating things. But the vast majority of it gets used for agriculture, and you can see that from this slide. This is, I've seen different estimates about the percentage of the world's water that gets used for raising food, but I've never seen anything less than about 2/3 of the world's water, or about 70%. And this goes up much higher than that. Now, what's interesting is, and you may know this, of course, that the amount of water that gets used depends on what you're producing. And there are really big differences in the water calculus depending on what's being produced and consumed. So this will show you the number of gallons of water that is necessary to produce 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds, of 4 different foods. So the first one is corn. So to produce 2.2 pounds of corn, it requires 172 gallons of water. All right, but we're going to go up. Next, snap peas. So you're up to 529 gallons. So we're now orders of magnitude beyond what the corn produced, but of course we're not even getting going yet. So the 1587 is raising pigs, where the 2.2 pounds requires a lot more water, and you can probably guess what the last one is, and that's beef. So if, to the extent that people are eating a lot of meat, it has real implications for water. And let's look at what's happening to meat consumption in just 2 countries, the US and China. So the US is showing increasing meat consumption, but you know, we've always consumed a lot of meat, so the number's not accelerating as much as what you see in China, where the acceleration is really going through the roof. And most people are attributing that to the fact that the economy in China has been booming, and that creates a larger middle class, and middle class people want middle class things, and part of that in China is having meat. So if meat consumption is going up like this, and water conditions are already hard, then what will this mean for things as we go forward, especially in areas of the world where water is more of a problem than others? And so you start to see this kind of thing. I mean, I could show you 100 slides like this of different places that are facing water shortages. And this is of real interest to the Defense Department and the State Department and world governments around the world, because how long can it be before countries go to war over water resources? If you're a country and you're downriver from a country that is exploiting all the water upriver, what choice do you have but to go to war to get that water? Or shared lakes or shared aquifers. There are a lot of these things that make countries vulnerable to civil strife, and some people say it's happening already. And the civil war in Syria is thought to be linked partially to drought, as you can see from this. So water is an issue, and meat consumption increasing around the world is helping exacerbate that problem. What about climate change? A very interesting publication came out from the FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization. They're part of the UN, on livestock and its impact on climate change. And they created this estimate that global greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture exceed emissions from all forms of transportation put together, all the cars and the trucks and the buses in the world. So why is there such an important, I mean, how is animal agriculture affecting climate change and greenhouse gas emissions? Go ahead.
I would say methane emissions from cows also too.
Okay. So the methane emissions from the cows is a big one. There's another emission from the cows, which is, anybody know? Nitrous oxide, which becomes part of the problem too. And these two gases have especially long half-lives when they get up into the atmosphere, far more than carbon dioxide. And so they're especially toxic when they get into the environment. But also, you can think of the petroleum-based inputs that are necessary in order to create the cattle in the first place. You're using petroleum-based fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides to raise the feed that the animals eat. The animals are shipped, some cases long distances, different points of their life from one feedlot to another. And then, of course, the meat has to get shipped to market. And so there are a lot of environmental inputs from meat consumption. And there's a lot of interest now in the intersection between agriculture and climate change. So we've talked here about the impact of agriculture driving climate change, but what about the reverse causation? What about the impact of climate change on agriculture? And this particular chart is really pretty amazing. Again, from the United Nations. This shows where wheat grows now in North America and where it's expected to grow in 2050. So 2050 isn't that far off. And where wheat grows now are the orange crosshatch bars, all the way from Texas, Oklahoma, into that narrow band in southern Canada. But by 2050, the only wheat that's expected to grow in the U.S., because of climate change, is expected to be in northern Minnesota and North Dakota, and that all gets pushed up into Canada. So Canada, at least with just wheat as the agricultural product, becomes a winner, and the U.S. becomes a loser in this particular climate change calculus. So if you take this and look at all the different products around the world, wheat might be particularly temperature sensitive, and others may be less so, but you can see a trend occurring here. And so the countries that are already struggling, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, with producing food, the likelihood that they're going to produce food has become even more challenging as time goes forward than it is now. Now, one part of the agriculture picture, my guess is that there's one part of the food picture that no one has thought about in all this discussion that we've had, and it has to do with fish. Did any of you think about fish as we were talking about all this? Okay, I never did either, and I'm glad you did.
I saw Cowspiracy, so.
Okay. The reason I thought about fish is when I came to Duke, which is now 4 years ago, I started interacting with people at the Nicholas School of the Environment, Nicholas Institute, and also the Duke Marine Lab, and started learning a lot more about fisheries and aquaculture than I had before, and it's an extremely interesting part of the picture. But you can see from these quotes that fish can become a very important part of dealing with food insecurity around the world, but there are real threats to our ability to create enough fish. I heard an estimate from a researcher about how much land mass, if you calculated the human need for protein going forward, given increases in population size, and if you were to meet that need with animal-based agriculture, like cows, chickens, and pigs, how much land mass would be necessary to do that. And it was an enormous area, something like half the mass of South America or something. Whereas in a very small area, you could produce that same amount of protein from fisheries and aquaculture. So this becomes really important too, but we don't think about fish as much as we might in this context. But it's important that we get fish right. It's important that we get animals right, plants right, and also fish right if we're going to be able to do this. So there are a number of very interesting reports that have come out by lots of different organizations and agencies. And this one again from the FAO, talks about how many more people will end up in poverty because of climate change, and that what this will mean in terms of agriculture and the environment. So this interaction between ag and environment is really a very important thing to tackle. Now, the fourth area that I mentioned of food policy was food safety and food security. And I'm not going to talk about this too much because it's the area among the four that I know least about. But it's important. And again, I can compare your generation to mine. So when I grew up, the only food safety issue people really worried about was trichinosis if you didn't cook your pork enough. But now, you guys are in a generation where E. coli, Campylobacter, and other foodborne illnesses, Listeria, are a real problem. And lots of people get harmed or killed, even killed by foodborne illnesses in a way that seems to be getting harder and harder to manage because the foods get put together from all kinds of different places. You know, you might have a produce food like Cheetos, let's say, that will have lots of different ingredients. And those ingredients will be coming from many places. And then they're put together, and then they're shipped out to many places. So controlling these outbreaks once they occur becomes a real challenge, and it's even more of a problem outside the U.S. than in the U.S., and it really affects trade between countries. You know, when there's a whiff of mad cow disease in the U.S., countries ban U.S. beef, and we ban imports from some places like China when we're worried about foodborne illnesses. So these are really an issue on the world scene. So getting back to the big picture here, food policy is really important to health policy. That's a pretty apparent connection, that if we're not eating a good diet, it's unlikely we're going to be healthy. But environment is a really big issue here. Education is interesting because how can people learn if they're not nourished? But also schools become an important place where people eat a lot of meals, and it's important to get that right. And then the others are pretty apparent as well. So it's good if we address these things, and it's nice people are more sensitized to it. So the problem that I see, going back to the 4 different areas, is that we have disconnected and uncoordinated food policy. And this happens very locally, but also globally. And I'll give you some examples of where the gaps lie. But it's almost as if the way food policy gets established is like the old whack-a-mole game, that somebody gets the attention of the people in power, and they enact some policy or some practice or program goes into effect, and you whack down that mole. But moles come up in other places, and sometimes they're adverse. And because nobody is watching that whole board, like this guy has to do if he's going to be good at the game, then you've got some problems. So I'll give you some examples of some of these conflicts. So one is our interest in having American industries prosper. And so that would be capitalism at its best. Because we're a global economy, a lot of the increased profits of some of the food companies is happening outside the U.S., but what are the public health consequences of that? So right now, the second most widely recognized corporate logo in China, aside from Chinese companies, does anybody know what it might be? KFC. That's right. Not many people know that. So that means KFC is booming in their business in China. Now, is that a good thing? Okay, one really has to ask that. If Coca Cola or McDonald's or any of the other big food producers end up with increased profits in these other countries, then what's the cost of that? Another interesting example is the Green Revolution. Does anybody know what the Green Revolution is? I look to you because you keep raising your hand. Go ahead.
It was like a massive increase in agriculture that happened with like Norman Borlaug and stuff, like growing, producing more food, and then also like the conflict of like we need to produce more food and grow more, but what is like the strain on the environment?
Right. That's exactly right. So it began back in the 1950s, and the key player in the early days was the man you mentioned named Norman Borlaug, who ended up winning the Nobel Prize. And the work was funded initially by the Rockefeller Foundation, but then others came in. And the idea was that instead of trying to export countries where there was a lot of food need, it would be a lot more helpful if they could grow their own food. And so the idea was to take technology as it existed then and export it around the world so that the countries become more efficient, increase their yields, and be able to grow food in places they weren't able to before. So selective breeding of plants that would resist drought would be an example of the technology. Better use of pesticides and fertilizers were part of this picture. More effective drilling for water was part of this, so crops could be irrigated. So this was a very incredible advance in a lot of ways. And if all you did was looked at yield of corn in Mexico, for example, or rice in some Asian countries, the numbers are very impressive. And that's part of the reason, as I mentioned before, that world hunger has improved over time. But there are environmental consequences of this. The exploitation of the groundwater near the surface has meant that people have had to drill deeper for drinking water, and some of that water is contaminated in some countries with things like arsenic. The heavy use of petroleum-based fertilizers and pesticides creates environmental problems. So Who knows what what's right and wrong here, or what's good or bad? Countries will have to work that out. But the fact that the fields don't talk to each other enough is creating a problem. Another really interesting debate is whether people who are recipients of the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, this used to be referred to as food stamps, should be permitted to use their benefits to buy things like soda. Okay, so let me just get a quick show of hands. You don't have to think about it, but I'd like everybody to vote if you could. Yes or no, should people who receive these benefits be permitted to use them to buy sugared beverages? How many of you would say yes? And how many would say no? Okay, so the noes have it, at least in this room. Now, it's actually a very interesting debate that has pitted two important communities against one another. So on one hand, the obesity and public health community says, why in the world is the government buying $4 billion worth of soda a year and giving it to people at no cost, and then having to pay for obesity and diabetes after that through Medicare and Medicaid? And if it's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, nobody would define soda as nutrition assistance. Now, on the other hand, you have the hunger community that says, wait a minute, people are already stigmatized who are on these benefits, and taking something away from them would exacerbate that problem. If people want to use their benefits to buy something like that that brings them pleasure, it's their choice. But they really get upset, rightfully so, when they say that conservative politicians in government tend not to like these food assistance programs, and that when you start talking about numbers like this, they have more ammunition to cut the programs, not just to rearrange the benefits, but to cut the programs. And that's a real threat to the programs. So what's happened is, because these two communities weren't talking when the issue first came up, when they finally did start to interact, it was just like this. And so there's a paralysis. Nothing's happening with this. There's no policy change. There's not really good research going on. And so it's essentially an impasse. Yes, please.
So I heard on a radio report, I think it was from NPR, that because of lots of, I think it was food lobbying from large corporations that produce soda and other unhealthy foods, that when you receive food assistance with your food stamps, it's often you're limited to certain types of things that you're allowed to buy with these food stamps. So when you're trying to get, say, healthy food, you only have a certain allocation of space in those food stamps that allow you to buy that healthy food. Then the other things allow you to buy chips, soda, cookies, whatever, right? And then I don't know if this is SNAP specifically, but this really, the program interviewed a number of really frustrated recipients of these food assistance programs that were look, we want to be healthy, but we only have a certain amount of allocation that lets us be healthy.
Right.
The other things can't be spent on healthy food anyway.
Right.
They only let you get the really bad things, cookies or instant food or stuff like that.
Okay, so the comment is, has the food industry been implicit in restricting the choices people might have through what they buy that steers people toward an unhealthy diet? It's a very good point. Now,
these recipients think, or rightfully so, that they are being restricted.
yeah, so they're not restricted. There's a fairly small list of things that you can't buy with food stamps. You can't buy non-food things like paper towels or something. You can't buy alcohol, and there's some other things you can't buy, but it's a pretty small list. So it's not so much the restrictions on what you can buy that limits people, but it's the relative cost of foods that gets in the way, because it costs a lot to buy healthy foods compared to what it costs to buy packaged processed foods that you can buy in bulk at low cost. And so the ideal situation would be to take, if you're going to take $4 billion and say, okay, people can't use it to buy soda, but we're going to put that $4 billion in to drive down the cost of healthy foods they could eat, then you would get that kind of a benefit occurring. But again, the impasse is keeping that from happening. Yes?
I just want to kind of SNAP actually tries to facilitate buying healthy foods. A lot of places you can get additional food for fewer benefits if you're putting at farmers markets. So So you might get like, $1.5 for every dollar if you shop at a farmer's
Or even
market.
double in some cases.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think within the actual benefits, SNAP is actually trying to facilitate those purchases.
So doesn't that also like sort of depend on whether there is a farmer's market in your area? So let's say you don't have transportation or you live in like a food desert.
Huge issue.
Like you're not going to be able to make it to
Yeah.
a farmer's market and use this benefit.
Yeah, huge issue. I mean, so, back when we talked about the role of poverty driving problems with food, you talked about things like access to healthy foods. We're talking about prices of healthy foods. All these things conspire. Systematic marketing of unhealthy foods to people most vulnerable in the population is another factor there. So these things are all really big issues. Emily, you had your hand up.
I was just going to build on what you were saying. I think they may have been talking about the food bank system, because I know that's another huge area where, corporations get tax write-offs if they donate, for instance, like cookies or soda that, isn't able to be sold in a grocery store anymore. So there's a monetary incentive there for them to donate those unhealthy foods. And then
Right.
similarly, it's really hard for food banks to store healthy foods.
Yes.
To store shelf-stable things like cookies. And so that is a huge issue. I think
Right.
people are going to work on.
Right, all these are really very important points. So let me just hurry up and try to get through what we're going to do. So it's interesting to think about how these areas come together. And the United Nations not long ago released a set of Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd just like to look at goal number 2 that you see there, which blown up looks like this: to end hunger and basically to do food in a sustainable way. And so these are 2 of the bullet points of things that the UN says we should try to accomplish by 2030, and all forms of malnutrition, but to produce food in a sustainable, environmentally friendly way. Boy, it's going to be hard to do either of those 2 things, much less both at the same time. So there's really a lot of work that needs to get done. So again, I'm going to skip just a few slides here and get to this point. So who's watching the whole picture? We got lots of things going on. Is anybody watching the whole thing? Well, not really. So who might be logical candidates? The CDC might be a logical candidate, but they really only pay attention to these things. The USDA, in fact, has people that pay attention to all 4, but some more than others. And if you talk to people who work there, they say that the people who work on one topic never talk to the people who work in others, because it's an enormous organization. WHO looks like this. The FAO looks like this. The foundations look like this. So you get the picture that there's always something missing in this. That's what we want to try to help solve by creating what I mentioned before, which is a World Food Policy Center, to which we now have launched. And so we're working with people with lots of different expertise inside and outside Duke, inside and outside the Triangle area, to try to capture the needed input from various stakeholders in order to produce a more sensible food system. So we held a summit here last year with people from a lot of interesting players from different organizations came together and talked with us about the World Food Policy Center. And we learned a lot from this. And there was affirmation on the importance of having such a thing as a center. So some of the things we're going to do in this center is, and I'll be happy to talk about any of these in some detail if you'd like, but you can see the things that we're mentioning here. But one of the things that I'd like to focus on is the last point there, which is we're going to be working with the city of Durham and a rural county or 2 in North Carolina to see about creating a model food systems community. So the question is, can you take one place in the country, Durham, North Carolina, and try to get everything right? Can you have state-of-the-art interventions to help address food insecurity? At the same time, you have state-of-the-art interventions to help address obesity, but they're working together. So instead of this, you get this, and you get synergies between the 2, and you get a set of policies and practices that allow good things to happen. And if you do this, some interesting topics come up as possibilities. So for example, not a topic that people think very much about, and I haven't mentioned yet, is food waste. So about 1/3 or more of the world's food gets not consumed, gets wasted at every point in the supply chain. If you were able to address food waste, you'd be able to help address food insecurity, because people would be able to get healthier foods. You'd help address obesity for the same reason, but help environment, because the food wouldn't be rotting in landfills and creating methane and contributing to climate change. So that would be an example of a win across areas. So that might be a place where these different constituencies could come together to try to create a model system where you address food waste that would produce wins across the different areas. So we're very excited about this, and there's a lot of interest in the area of doing this kind of thing because the city government people seem very interesting. We're blessed by having a lot of people at Duke interested in food issues in places like you'd expect. Global Health Institute, the med school, but there are people in the business school, the law school, and a big cluster of people in the divinity school who work on food issues as well. But then not very far away, we've got a really good School of Agriculture at NC State, our land-grant college, and only 8 miles away is a world-class School of Public Health at UNC with a lot of people who do good work on food. So this is a particularly interesting place in the country to do this. Plus we've got urban Durham, and we've got lots of rural possibilities too to do something. So we're very excited about this project. We'll be doing lots of global things too, but lots of local things. So I'll stop there and tell you that I'm all happy I got to talk to you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.